Picture this. Disney is building a brand new theme park resort right here in the United States. It's a full third property and marks Disney's first expansion into a new state since Walt Disney World opened in 1971. And it's coming to the major metropolitan area of Washington, D.C. But rather than be themed after fantasy and make-believe, it's themed after the very real history of the United States. This is the story of one of Disney's most famous unbuilt parks, Disney's America. Happy Mouselets Monday! This week is the week of the 4th of July, so today we are talking about one of the most patriotic projects that Disney ever considered building. So to begin, let's rewind to the early 90s and take a quick hop over the ocean to Disneyland Paris, or as it was called at the time, Euro Disney. The park was still under construction, but it was already clear that it was going to open with significant debt. But Michael Eisner, Disney's CEO at the time, who had just successfully revitalized Disney's movie business, was determined to do the same thing for the parks. So despite the rampant problems at Euro Disney, he proposed building a smaller regional theme park within the United States. At this time, the movie Pocahontas was being developed, so American history was top of mind, and American history had always been an interest of Disney dating back to the years of Walt. A year after Disneyland opened, an expansion to Main Street USA was proposed called Liberty Street, which would have been set in colonial Boston in 1775. It was never built, but in 1963, another American-based project came up, this time in St. Louis. It was a proposal for a new park called Riverfront Square, and it would have combined elements of Disneyland and American history. Again, it was never built, but we do see American history present throughout the parks, with great moments with Mr. Lincoln, the Hall of Presidents, and even Liberty Square itself. So, in the early 90s, when they were considering building a regional park, the head of Disney Parks, Dick Nunis, suggested that Michael Eisner take a trip to Colonial Williamsburg. He thought that Eisner might find it inspiring, and he did. He was inspired specifically by how Williamsburg immerses visitors into colonial history. And so he considered building his regional park there, but ultimately the area was deemed too small and too far from the nearest metropolitan area of Washington, D.C., which was about 3 hours away. But Eisner was hooked on the idea, so he assigned the head of Disney's design and development firm, Peter Rummel, to scout out locations. And Rummel ultimately came back with a 3,000-acre site about 35 miles from Washington, D.C. in Prince William County. 2,300 of those acres were owned by Exxon, who hadn't done anything with the land, so Disney secretly purchased an option to buy from them. And then they quietly began buying up the surrounding land as well. And just like they were able to secretly purchase land at Walt Disney World and mostly get away with it, the same happened here. They went largely undetected until just a few days before the announcement of the theme park in November 1993, which was officially announced as Disney's America. In a press release, Disney wrote this about the location in Prince William County. The location has been chosen with great care. Disney's America is in close proximity to Washington, D.C., the world's living symbol of freedom and democracy, with its clear focus on our nation's public affairs and international relations. And it is sited in Virginia, the Old Dominion state, with its rich historical heritage. The history of America is closely linked to that of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Jamestown was the first permanent English-speaking settlement in North America. The surrenders ending both the American Revolution and the Civil War occurred here. The state is called the Mother of Presidents because 8 chief executives were born here. In commerce and inventiveness, Virginia has also been a leader. The first manufacturing plant in the United States, the first iron furnace, the country's first transportation canal, the state where the mechanical reaper was invented, the site of the oldest daily newspaper in the Republic. The immediate access to Disney's America for millions of annual visitors, as a complement to their experience of our nation's capital in Washington, D.C., makes this site in Virginia the ideal choice for the Walt Disney Company. And at the time of the announcement, the concept for Disney's America was highly developed, thanks to lead Imagineer Bob Weiss. So let's look at what it would consist of. Rather than Main Street USA, the entrance to this park was called Crossroads USA, which was set in the 1800s to 1850s. Disney's early pamphlet about the park read, quote, "A spirited portrait of mid-19th century commerce, Crossroads USA is the hub of Disney's America, launching guests on an unforgettable journey through the vivid tapestry of American history. An 1840 train trestle bridge marks the entrance to this territory and supports 2 antique steam trains that visitors may board for a trip around the park's 9 territories." This area was also unique because while the first floor of the buildings on Crossroads USA would house shops, the second and third floors, as well as surrounding buildings, were meant to house an actual hotel, meaning that guests would be able to stay within the park. Quote, "Visitors to Crossroads USA may live the American dream of the Civil War era, literally, by lodging amid the hustle and bustle in a themed 19th century inn, with additional suites spread throughout the town." And as that description noted, beyond the hotel, there would also be deluxe suites, scattered throughout the other 8 territories of the park that surrounded a central lake. So moving past Crossroads USA, guests would encounter their first territory, called President's Square, set in 1750 to 1800. Quote, "From the struggle of the colonists and the War of Independence to the formation of the United States and its government, President Square celebrates the birth of democracy and the patriots who fought to preserve it. Through the magic of Disney's audio animatronics technology, guests may meet these American heroes in the Hall of Presidents, a moving account of the making of our nation." It also would have an outdoor amphitheater located on the waterfront for live performances and demonstrations. And overall, it was going to be very similar to Walt's concept in 1956 for Liberty Street and what later became Walt Disney World's Liberty Square. Next up, guests would reach the territory of Native America, covering the years 1600 to 1810. Quote, "Native America explores the life of America's first inhabitants, their accord with the environment, and their timeless works of art they created long before European colonization. Guests may visit an Indian village representing such eastern tribes as the Powhatans, or join in a harrowing Lewis and Clark raft expedition through pounding rapids and churning whirlpools. This Lewis and Clark river raft expedition was likely inspired by a ride that Imagineer Mark Davis created for the never-built St. Louis Riverfront Square Park. And this area of Native America was also meant to have an overlay from the film Pocahontas, assuming that it did well once released, which Eisner assumed that it would. Traversing a bridge, guests would next encounter the Civil War Fort, covering the years 1850 to 1870. Quote, "Emblematic of our nation's greatest crisis, the Civil War Fort allows guests to experience the reality of a soldier's daily life. Inside, the wizardry of Disney's Circle Vision 360 technology will transport visitors into the center of Civil War combat. Outside, they may encounter an authentic reenactment of a period battle or gather along Freedom Bay for a thrilling nighttime spectacular based on the historic confrontation between the Monitor and the Merrimack." Next up, the years 1930 to 1945 would be showcased in 3 different territories, each with a particular focus. So continuing their journey around the lake, guests would encounter the first of these 3 areas, called Family Farm. Quote, "Offering a cornucopia of pastoral delights and insight into their production, Family Farm pays homage to the working farm, the heart of early American families. Visitors see how crops are harvested, learn how to make homemade ice cream or milk a cow, and even participate in a nearby country wedding, barn dance, and buffet." This concept was very similar to an idea that Walt had to build something called Walt's Boyhood Farm in his hometown of Marceline, Missouri, where he wanted people to come visit in order to get firsthand farm experience. This was, of course, never built, but got a second life here at Disney's America. The next 1930 to 1945 territory was called State Fair, and quote, "State Fair celebrates small-town America at play with a nostalgic reaction of such popular rides as a 60-foot Ferris wheel and a classic wooden roller coaster, as well as a tribute to the country's favorite pastime, baseball. Amid a backdrop of rolling cornfields, fans may have a hot dog and take a seat in an authentic, old-fashioned ballpark and watch America's legendary greats gather for an exhibition all-star competition." In 1986, Eisner had actually set up a temporary overlay of Disney called State Fair. It was hugely successful, generating increased attendance and merchandise sales during the off-season, and proving to be very popular amongst guests, even featuring a Ferris wheel of its own. So it makes sense why he wanted to bring this concept to Disney's America. The last of these 3 1930 to 1945 territories was Victory Field. Quote, "The flight of the Wright brothers opened a new chapter in American history, bringing with it thrilling exploits and military advancements. With the assistance of modern technology, guests at Victory Field may parachute from a plane or operate tanks and weapons in combat, and experience firsthand what America's soldiers have faced in defense of freedom." This area was going to feature the world's first inverted dueling roller coaster called Dogfighter, which would have had guests fighting in American versus German biplane vehicles. Continuing their journey, guests would encounter the first of 2 areas covering the years 1870 to 1930 called We the People. Quote, "Framed by a building resembling Ellis Island, We the People recognizes the courage and triumph of our immigrant heritage, from the earliest native settlers to the latest political refugees. A powerful multimedia attraction, We the People expires and explains how conflict among these varied cultures continue to help shape this nation." About this area, lead Imagineer Bob Weiss said, quote, "The theme here is about the diverse people of this country and conflicts that have occurred during different periods of our history. You'll see much about the civil rights movement, Vietnam, the other wars we fought, and how individual efforts of Americans of all races and creeds help define the rights they have now. There will also be an area devoted to different ethnic groups, a major food experience, and a major live show on diverse music." Lastly, guests would encounter the final territory, also covering the years 1870 to 1930, called Enterprise. Quote, The factory town of Enterprise plays host to inventions and innovations spawned by the ingenuity and can-do spirit that catapulted America to the forefront of industry. Within Enterprise, those daring enough can climb aboard the Industrial Revolution, a high-speed adventure through a turn-of-the-century mill culminating in a narrow escape from its fiery vat of molten steel. And despite it being described as a high-speed adventure, the Industrial Revolution was actually meant to be part roller coaster, part museum, because on either side of the coaster tracks there would be exhibits featuring American technology. And so, while many of these concepts were intentionally vague, the overall structure of the park was highly developed. And it wasn't going to be just a park. It would have the previously mentioned hotels and suites, a campground, and even a golf course. And all of this was meant to be accomplished on a budget of $650 million, half of what was being used for Euro Disney. They estimated that while the park would have to close for 2 to 3 months per year due to weather, they'd see around 30,000 guests per day during peak season. And they believed they'd create 3,000 jobs within the park and thousands of others at surrounding businesses, as well as generate millions of new tax dollars for the state of Virginia. And so when the park was announced, Virginia Governor-elect George Allen was one of the project's biggest allies, but others in the public quickly turned against it. During initial announcements, lead Imagineer Bob Weiss told reporters, quote, "This is not a Pollyanna view of America. We want to make you a Civil War soldier. We want to make you feel like what it was like to be a slave, or what it was like to escape through the Underground Railroad." Other press releases promised painful, agonizing, and disturbing exhibits about slavery and war. And these comments did not sit well amongst the public and specifically amongst historians. They felt that Disney would create a simplified, sanitized, entertainment-tilted version of history, stripping away the complexity and nuance necessary to properly tell America's stories. Prominent American history writer and historian Shelby Foote warned that Disney would, quote, sentimentalize it out of recognition, and many worried that sensitivities to slavery, Native American genocides, labor disputes, and African American rights would be lost. In an effort to quell these historians, Eisner brought a group of them to Epcot, showing off the American Adventure Pavilion and its 45-minute show, but that just made matters worse. To historians, this glamorized show was proof that Disney could not properly convey American history, although they did respond more positively when they later saw Hall of Presidents. Other general public pushback centered around the park's proximity to the Manassas National Battlefield, a deeply sacred Civil War site. Historians felt that this would desecrate the ground over which men fought and died, and were concerned that tourists would rather go see a reenactment of Manassas rather than the historical site itself, meaning that Disney would be removing tourists and dollars from real historical nonprofit locations. And despite Disney's upfront commitment to preserving the environment, other complaints arose around the effects the park would have on air pollution, the inevitable increase in traffic, and the fact that it would result in the destruction of 16 battlefields, 17 store districts, and 10 towns. But Disney continued on. They began recruiting their own historians in order to try to push back on the historians that were opposing them. They donated $100,000 to the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Battle Sites, and they continued to push the state of Virginia to help create the infrastructure necessary to support the park. However, in March of 1994, that pushing meant that they actually issued an ultimatum to the state, saying that they would abandon the project altogether if the Virginia General Assembly failed to pass a $150 million improvement package. The package was passed, but this ultimatum worsened public perception. Then in June, the United States House of Representatives introduced a resolution opposing the park, and a subcommittee of the United States Senate's Committee of Energy and Natural Resources held a hearing regarding the proposed project's environmental impact. Virginia Governor Allen spoke on their behalf, saying that history should be for all citizens, not just wealthy historians. And ultimately, the federal government decided not to intervene, landing another win for Disney, but another loss in the public perception. And finally, the month before, a group of historians created a group called Protect Historic America, specifically created to stop the build of the park. They even argued against the name Disney's America, saying that it implied that Disney owned the country. So while Eisner was still passionate about the project, the public opposition was a huge challenge, and they began to redevelop the park. Now it would be called Disney's American Celebration, with a focus that was a bit more fun than the previous iteration. And rather than highlighting specific periods or events in American history, it would focus on themes such as democracy, the entry area where guests would receive a civic orientation before proceeding to the rest of the park, intentionally framing their journey in the context of democratic values. Family/generations, featuring a multi-generational story show similar to Carousel of Progress. The land, modeled after the pavilion in Epcot. Creativity and fun, with nostalgic carnivals, ballparks, and even a replica of Coney Island. work with virtual factory tours of popular brands such as Apple, Crayola, and Ben & Jerry's, all of which could be used as potential sponsorships. Service and Sacrifice, a military-themed time travel experience. American People, a revamped version of the Ellis Island area featuring the story of immigration told through a musical comedy Muppet show. Streets of America, featuring cuisine from around the country, similar to what later became Downtown Disney. And Disney's America Live, with interactive arenas for hog calling and roping demos. But this concept only lasted 6 weeks. On September 17, 1994, a huge protest took place, once again highlighting the overall public opposition to this park. Executives were concerned that fighting this rising sentiment would be difficult or impossible, and that it would cause delays and issues once the park actually opened. And furthermore, the company was facing growing debt from Euro Disney. And with the death of Disney president Frank Wells a few months earlier, the company was in a state of unrest. Recent research for Disney's America had found that the parks would actually have to be closed for 4 months out of the year instead of 2 to 3, which hurt projected profits by about 10%. And so ultimately, on September 28, 1994, Michael Eisner officially announced that the project was canceled. Disney relinquished their Exxon options in December and sold off the rest of the remaining land in March of 1995. But that wasn't the end of Disney's America. Initially, Disney tried to move it to Pennsylvania, but protesters showed up there too. And then a few years later, Disney took a different approach. At the time, they were looking into building a second park in Anaheim, and the nearby Knott's Berry Farm Park went up for sale. It already had a full-size recreation of Independence Hall, so Disney put in a bid to buy it, hoping to turn it into Disney's America. But A, some Disney executives were unsure since the park wasn't actually super close to Disneyland, and B, the Knotts family ultimately declined because they didn't want their whole park to be changed. And so Disney's America did not come to be. But years later, when Anaheim did get a second park with California Adventure, many of those Disney's America concepts were used. Soarin' was initially conceptualized for Victory Field as a flying-themed attraction tied to aviation history. Grizzly River Run evolved from the Lewis and Clark whitewater raft ride planned for Native America. Paradise Pier, with its wooden-style roller coaster California Screaming and Mickey's Fun Wheel Ferris wheel, was inspired by the State Fair territory. Condor Flats, the park's aviation land, was based off of Victory Field. And Bountiful Valley Farm, a farm-themed area in the park, originated from the family farm concept. And so that is the story of Disney's America, a park that almost came to be but sadly never was, primarily due to public perception. If you love Disney lore, facts, history, and secrets, check us out on Mouselets Mondays where we post deep dives. But for now, thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.